Here we go. So our question today is, was Jesus married? And there is a lot of interest in this topic. And so we're going to talk today about why people are so fascinated by this question and why it matters, or does it matter for our faith, for our everyday life. But certainly there has been quite a bit of speculation about this question in pop culture, even for people who are not invested in the question from a perspective of how it affects their personal faith or the faith of their denomination or their religion, but just kind of as a curiosity. And I think that there is a reason why even people who really aren't interested in religion or Christianity in general are interested in this question. So we'll talk about that some today. So I just put up some pictures. We've got the Da Vinci Code, which we'll talk about today. And of course, that has to do with the Last Supper and the Holy Grail, and we'll get into a little bit of that later. And then also in the movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, which if you remember that one was quite scandalous when it came out. We've got Jesus surviving his crucifixion and moving on to marry and have a regular life. And so the scandal of that idea is also there, and I think affects our faith, affects our theology. And so we'll talk about all of those things today. But let's start with our assumptions like we always do. And I wanted to ask two questions as we get started, because I think that it's important for us to understand that what we assume when we think about the question, is someone married, is different in our context today than it is in other times and places. So what is marriage? Well, we in our society, I lost you.
You're back.
That was weird.
Yes.
Divine intervention, huh?
Yes, apparently they wanted to interrupt me mid thought there. But
so what is marriage?
Let's try again. What is marriage? It is not the same thing that we consider it to be in terms of what the Bible thinks of it and what it would have been understood to be under Jesus. So we understand it to be a combination of a government contract. We have to register our intention to become a legal unit with our government, but then sometimes we also add on top of that a religious ceremony. And that is a fairly modern development. The idea of having the dual requirements of registering with the state and then also registering with the church for consecration of the marriage actually was not instituted until John Calvin during the Reformation. So it's fairly new. And priests were not required to officiate weddings by the Catholic Church until 1563. So marriage was not something that was religious in nature. It was something that was societal, something that was social in nature, and then eventually became something that was legal in nature, but didn't really have much to do with the church until the Reformation period. But the Bible has a lot of interesting assumptions that it makes about what marriage is as well. So I wanted to take a couple minutes just to quickly look at some of these ideas. At the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, it talks about how Adam and Eve were partners. God created Eve to support and be a partner for Adam. And it says, therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And so what this is getting at is that basically sex and marriage are the same thing. In ancient Israel and in ancient Judaism, the first person that you had sex with was your partner, was your spouse. And sex is a binding and permanent contract in which you are are connected to one another in a spiritual sense. You're connected to one another in a practical sense. You are connected to one another in a social sense for the rest of your lives, ideally. And so that's kind of different than what we've got going on today. And it's different from some things that even developed over the course of the time that the Bible was developing. But we've got a little bit of a sense of marriage and what marriage looked like in a couple of different places, including in Genesis chapter 29, where we have the story of how Jacob came to be married to his wives, who were Leah and then Rachel. And in this story, Jacob wants to marry Rachel, and so he works it out with his uncle Laban, who is the father of Rachel, that he will work for 7 years to kind of earn the hand of Rachel, and then at the end of the 7 years, he will take her as his wife. So, starting with Genesis 29, verse 21, it says, "Then Jacob said to Laban, 'Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is complete.' So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, 'What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?' Laban said, 'This is not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years.' Jacob did so and completed his week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife." So we've got evidence that there is some kind of feast that is involved. So there's celebration when there's a wedding. But Jacob says, "Give me my wife." So there's already a sense that when they made the contract for him to work for 7 years to earn this person, that they were already spouses, that she already belonged to him. Because of course, at this time, women were possessions, property, not fully human. And so, "Give me my wife, that I may go into her, for my time is complete." And then there's this feast. But then Laban tricks Jacob into receiving Leah and sleeping with Leah. And so you notice that Jacob doesn't say, "Hey, you gave me the wrong daughter, just give me the other one." Jacob accepts that he is now married to Leah, and he has to do additional work to earn the woman that he originally wanted, which is Rachel. So there's this sense of it's already kind of a done deal when the deal is made, and when the contract is made that this is going to be my wife. I get to call her my wife, but I don't get to consummate that marriage. I don't get to officially be married to her until my side of the deal is finished. But then once the consummation takes place, you're stuck with it. You can't just say, "Oh, this is the wrong daughter, I want the other one." It's too late. You've already made her your wife. And so you have to take on a second wife, which is her sister, which is a little weird. But besides that, we've got kind of some of these ideas about marriage going on here. And then as time goes on, and of course, these stories take place far apart from one another, but as time goes on, how marriage looks and how it works is a little different. And so I wanted to look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 19, because this is more of what marriage looked like in Jesus' time, which of course is what we're interested in here, to know, was Jesus married? What would that have meant for him? And so in Matthew chapter 1, it talks about the marriage of Jesus's parents, Mary and Joseph. And it says, "When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be pregnant from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to divorce her quietly." So at this time, there is a sense of the division between betrothal or engagement and the actual marriage in terms of a distance of time. But you notice some of the interesting language that's used here. They're engaged, but they have not yet lived together, which of course is a euphemism for they haven't slept together yet. And she is found to be pregnant. So Joseph knows that because they have not slept together, it's not his child, but it says her husband, Joseph. So there's already this social sense that they are married because the betrothal has taken place. They are contracted together. They are covenanted together to be married, but they are not married yet because they have not lived together. They have not slept together. And so the period of betrothal, between betrothal and marriage, is this kind of weird space where contractually you're married, but spiritually, physically, socially, you're not considered to be married yet. So there's still a sense that to be married means to have consummated the marriage, but then there's also this legal aspect of it where he is her husband, but not completely yet, like an already but not yet kind of situation going on in this awkward in-between stage. And so that would have been kind of the practice of marriage that Jesus would have assumed was part of, how you go about getting married. So any questions about that? Okay. So moving on to the next question about under assumptions, I want to just talk a little bit about what the purpose of marriage is. I think that there are a lot of different understandings of why we get married, and the Bible, of course, has some different ideas about why we get married, possibly than some of the assumptions that we make today. I think we're a little bit more egalitarian than they were during this time period. And so there's a little bit of a different understanding of, why would you get married? What is the purpose of that? And what do you get out of it? And what do you give into it? And that kind of thing. But there are some places in our Bible that give us some ideas, and this isn't all of it, but some ideas about what is going on in terms of why you would get married. And of course, a lot of these questions are very basic, and so we're not going to have a lot of very direct answers in our Bible, because when people are writing, within their own context, they're not going to spend the time explaining, where these kind of accepted things are coming from. If I'm writing about our current city council, I'm not going to sit there and write out the history of every person who's on that council and how long they've been there, and how they got elected, and what their types of what the platform was in their campaign. We kind of assume that everybody who's interested in reading what I'm going to write already knows those things. I'm going to just skip straight to kind of the analysis part of it. And assume that everybody knows all of that background. And the Bible's the same way. People are assuming that people accept the background of what marriage is, and then we get things that are kind of commentaries on or corrections of problems that are going on within the society. So in Deuteronomy, as an example of something from our Hebrew scriptures, we've got a law that talks about what happens when a man dies and leaves his wife as a widow, and especially as a widow with no son, specifically. So Deuteronomy chapter 25 says, "When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel." So this indicates that marriage has several purposes. One of them is to continue the family line, make a son, so that you can keep on going with, the ownership of the property, and the family lineage, and this stuff about being blotted out of Israel. That particular family will continue to go forward. But it does say that he will take her in marriage and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And so there is a sense here that, that duty is to impregnate her first and foremost, but there's also the duty of caring for her until her son can take care of her. So there is a sense here that this law is attempting to protect the women who are vulnerable in these situations. If they don't have a son to take care of them when their husband dies, then they have nobody, as we know from stories like the story of Ruth and Naomi. And so this expectation that she be taken care of until her child can take care of her is an important social rule that protects people who are vulnerable in the society until they can establish kind of a more normative way of helping themselves by having a son that's old enough to take care of her. So that's one place that we can find some evidence. And then for just an example from our New Testament, from Matthew chapter 19, we've got Jesus, who is arguing with some leaders about this very law, this law about a brother taking his deceased brother's wife and impregnating her on his behalf. And Jesus talks about, Jesus' answer to their questions is that in the kingdom of God, there is no marriage, there is no giving in marriage, there is no taking in marriage. Everyone is equal, and there's no need for marriage. And so then we can pick up here with Matthew 19, verse 10. The disciples said to Jesus, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." So very interesting, because Jesus is saying that there's an assumption of the connection between marriage and sex. If someone is a eunuch, they cannot be married because they cannot procreate. So this focus on the connection from marriage to sexuality to procreation are all kind of jumbled together into one understanding of what marriage is about. And so there is a sense of all of these things that are involved with the idea of asking whether Jesus would have been or could have been married. We have to assume that marriage would not have been a spiritual, pure marriage that does not involve sex in any way, because that is not how marriage was understood at this point in time. So any questions about any of that before we jump in? Okay. So I wanted to start out by sharing with you biblical evidence for Jesus's marital status. And I hope that you're ready for this. Here it is.
There isn't any.
There isn't any. There is none.
Okay, so they said that nobody didn't get married in the day. So why would we think this guy wouldn't have been married?
So that is one of the things that I am about to bring up.
Okay.
On the one hand, just because the Bible doesn't talk about something doesn't mean that it didn't exist. The Bible doesn't tell us what Jesus' favorite food was. So should we assume that Jesus didn't have a favorite food? Should we assume that Jesus never ate anything other than those very specific times that talks about him eating? Of course not. We know that Jesus ate like a normal human several times a day if he could find food, and that he probably had a food that his palate particularly liked. Just because it wasn't written down doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so when we talk about making arguments for something having existed because it doesn't talk about it, it doesn't refute it, then we're arguing from silence. And that is not a great way to make an argument, but you can try. There is a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that is arguing for the right of people like Paul and other apostles to be married, although Paul chose not to be. But in chapter 9, verse 5 in 1 Corinthians says, "Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" And so a lot of people who argue about this particular question say, if Jesus was married, then don't you think that this particular argument would have been really much better supported by saying, hey, I have a right to be married to a believing wife just as much as Jesus did? But it doesn't say that. It says, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas. And so it kind of goes to those second tier people that you use to support your argument rather than going straight to Jesus. So some people say that this verse proves that Jesus was not married, because if he had been, then they would have used that as their argument, and it would have supported the argument much better than pointing only to the disciples and Jesus' brothers and to Peter. But that's no more supported than the assumption that everybody would have been married, and so Jesus should have been married and must have been married. So argument from silence doesn't really help us here. Additionally, we have John chapter 19, for example, where it talks about Jesus' crucifixion and how Jesus tried to take care of his mother. It says, "Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, 'Woman, here is your son.' And he said to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home." So this actually is an interesting passage, because people on both sides of this question have used this passage as evidence for their own idea and what they were trying to prove. Because Jesus is there on the cross and he wants to make sure that his mother is taken care of, because at this point we are assuming that Joseph is dead and Jesus, her son, is dying. He makes sure to take care of her. He connects her with someone who is going to treat her as if he is her son moving forward. So if he did that for his mother, why didn't he do it for his wife? Particularly if his wife was Mary Magdalene, who is present during this. But then others say, well, Mary Magdalene was there and everybody knew that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, were a pair, were together. And so if Mary, the mother of Jesus, is now connected to this disciple who was going to take care of her, then we can also assume that his wife, Mary Magdalene, would have gone along with that too and been part of that. And so because Jesus, I guess in this case, they're arguing that he didn't have any literal brothers, any biological brothers, he is creating this new family on behalf of his mother and this disciple, and then according to these people also his wife, Mary Magdalene, who was present during this interchange. And so both of these sides, though, are arguing from conjecture, which again doesn't really work. Either side can create the system that they want to create for their argument to work within that, even the same passage. So we can't argue from silence and come up with anything definitive. We can't argue from conjecture and come up with anything definitive. And we have no evidence. So how do we answer this question? Well, end of the day, we really can't. But I want to talk to you a little bit about how historically this question has become important, and a little bit about why that might be. Why has this been such an important question over the course of time? Any questions about the biblical witness before we move on to that, though?
It makes for good fiction.
It does. It does. Yeah. So people have actually been very interested in the marital status of Jesus for a long time. It starts all the way back at the very beginning when the early apostles were spreading the good news about Jesus, and different philosophical groups encountered this new concept, which of course at that time was not called Christianity, but eventually became known as Christianity, including the philosophical adherents to Stoicism and Gnosticism. Stoicism said that you have to remove yourself from emotion, from your physical body, from your physical needs. You have to be as spiritual, as philosophical, as logical as you possibly can by removing those connections with kind of the physicality of who you are. And so many Stoic groups forbade their adherents from engaging in sex because that was, a passion, that was something that was incorrect in terms of their teachings. The Gnostics, on the other hand, believed that the only way for you to gain wisdom is to have experience, wisdom through experience. And so Gnostics were all into anything that gave you new experiences that would help you to gain new wisdom. And so just these two groups, you can see, would have had a disagreement on whether Jesus even could have been married for it to make sense philosophically within their system. A Stoic would say, of course, Jesus wouldn't have been married, would not have engaged in sexuality, because that's philosophically, wrong. That's dirty. That is demeaning to who he is as a God man. And so of course he would not have been engaged with this. But Gnostics would have said, well, if this guy is supposed to be, somebody that I can relate to, then he's got to have all the same experiences that I have. And so sexuality is something that is part of the human experience. And if he didn't have any experience of that, then how's he supposed to connect to me on that? How am I supposed to believe that he is the source of all wisdom if he doesn't even have this particular experience of something that is very basic to the human experience? So they were kind of arguing about this. And a lot of the early church fathers, even as early as Clement, who was writing in the late 100s, so we're not even full 200 years away from the events of Jesus' life, he was writing against teachers who had declared that marriage was equal to sexual immorality, that any sex with anyone, including a spouse, is sexually immoral, that we should not allow Christians to marry, we should not allow them to engage in sexual practice, because it's very important that we divide ourselves from this. We establish ourselves in this very philosophical way and don't engage with bodily interests. But Clement says that even though we as Christians may be married, Jesus definitely was not. Because we have to keep Jesus separated out from that passion, from that sullying by the experience of human and physical satisfaction, if you will. It's part of being in the head instead of in the heart or in the body. This division, this Greek understanding of the division of the role of the body. And that argument continued to develop and continued to take a really important role in the early church's development of the idea of who Jesus is. What is the identity of Jesus? And these arguments are still called the Christological controversies. Who is Jesus? What is going on with this guy? And so we've got all kinds of different questions that are mixed up here. We've got the argument between Greek and Jewish philosophy of the body. Is the body a trap, a cage in which the soul is entrapped for its lifetime, and then when you die, you leave your corrupted body behind and get to escape with your pure soul into eternity? which is kind of what we believe today. That's Greek philosophy. Or Jewish philosophy. We are bodies. It's not about our soul escaping. Our soul is who we is not who we are. We are enlivened. We receive the breath of God to animate us, but who we are is our bodies. And so what makes a human is the physical stuff. And what makes a human alive is God breathing that life into us, breathing that spark of divinity into us. And so this, you can see that this is a very different understanding. Is the body the center of who we are, or is the body a trap, a kind of extra thing that we're stuck with until we can escape this corrupted earth? And so the Christological controversies involved this. Who was this Jesus guy? Was he a God that walked among us? Was he human in some way? How does all of this work? If he was only a God, then how could he have died? And if he didn't die, then is our salvation secured? What is the process through which God is reconciled to us if Jesus didn't actually die? But if Jesus is only a human, then he is sinful. He's just like the rest of us. And so we can't come up with a theological reason why he's special, why he's different than any of the rest of us, that would bring about some kind of change on behalf of the world. And so over the course of time, they kind of start to develop these ideas that become part of the creeds that we even still say today, like the Nicene Creed. And I think that what ended up happening was they ended up erring on the side of Jesus' divinity, because there were a lot of heresies, a lot of philosophers, a lot of theologians who they were getting a little bit too human in their descriptions of Jesus for the comfort of a lot of these people who adhered to Greek philosophy and who believed that it was really important to keep that spirit and body divided, keep the physical world and the spiritual realm separated from one another, not to sully the idea of God with all the corruption of this temporal world of physicality. And so I think we get a lot of our historical connections to who Jesus is as being more of that up there, and not that I'm right here with you, I'm your friend, I'm your brother kind of stuff that was taught earlier. I think we're coming around and starting to kind of focus more on the humanity of Jesus, but for a long time I think that was a scary thing, because it made things a lot more complicated than even they were, which, as you can tell, it was already very complicated with all of the different understandings and disagreements and questions that were being asked. So as time went on, though, this idea that Jesus was married is not something that went away, even after they decided on, what is the party line going to be here? How is our theology going to be established? What is orthodox and what is heretical? Even as late as the 13th century, there was a heresy of the Cathars. And one of the things that their enemies, their detractors, would write about them was that they believed that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Christ, or in some cases, they were even accused of believing that Mary Magdalene was the concubine of Christ, that they weren't actually married, that she was a prostitute or a mistress of Christ.
Wait, how could that be? If you had sex, you were married, then how could being a concubine be other?
Because by this point, by the time we get to the 13th century, that's not our understanding of sex anymore, right? We have now reached a point where you marry someone and it's a legal ceremony, and then you go sleeping around with whoever you want, and that's not marriage. You can have your concubines, you can have your prostitutes, you can have your neighbor's wife, all that kind of stuff. And it's not right. You're not supposed to be doing it, but it's different. It's a different understanding of what marriage is. By the time we're in medieval Europe, they have a different understanding of what marriage is. And so they can say things like, oh, well, Mary Magdalene was, a mistress of Christ. They weren't actually married.
How can you have a concubine if you don't have a wife? Okay. I will parse this out on my own. It's okay.
And that's not, and the thing here too to remember is that the people who are writing this stuff are the enemies of the Cathars, right? It's not we don't have anything from the Cathars themselves telling us what they believed. It's just these people who are accusing them. And so they're writing down things that they know are going to get them into trouble. And so is it true that the Cathars really did believe that Mary Magdalene was the concubine of Christ? We will never know, because we don't have any record of what the Cathars actually believe. We only have this stuff that was written down by people who hated them, people who wanted to get them into trouble. So I have to kind of keep that in mind too. So then this is an interesting turn. In 1886, there was a French socialist named Louis Martin, and he started doing some writing about Jesus, and he claimed that based on his research, Jesus was a socialist, Jesus was an atheist, and before the crucifixion, he impregnated Mary Magdalene with a child. And he says that what happened after the crucifixion was that Mary traveled to Provence, which is in France, which, just so happens to be the same country that Louis is from. And he gave birth to a son whose name was Maximin. And he had a whole argument about how this happened and why this happened, and the whole history was written down. And this actually did not cause a huge stir in the society. A reviewer from the same time period that he was writing read his writing and called the idea that Mary Magdalene would have been impregnated with Jesus' child and given birth to him in France. He called it certainly strange. So not heretical, not a problem for the church, just something weird that this fringe guy, this socialist atheist, is deciding to kind of impose his views on this character Jesus. And it's certainly strange that this would be the case. But this is not the last time that we find connections between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in France, of course, as we move forward. As we move into the later 20th century, things start to amp up a lot more. In 1972, Donovan Joyce published a book called The Jesus Scroll. And in this book, he claims that he has found evidence that Jesus survived the crucifixion, that he settled at Masada so that he could marry, and eventually he died in the suicide pact at Masada when the Romans attacked. This is a very famous historical event that actually happened, which is that the people of Masada, who were understood to be Jewish Essenes, a particular sect of Judaism, were at this military base called Masada, and the Romans came and they had a what's that called? Not a siege with a G, siege of Masada, and they were starving the people to death. And then eventually they decided, because it was up high, they were going to bring in some slaves and they were going to build a ramp so that they could get into Masada and kill everyone. And as this was happening, the people in Masada decided that they were not going to allow the Romans to come in and murder them and pillage and rape. They were going to kill themselves. And so by the time the Romans got there, everyone was dead. And so Donovan Joyce says that Jesus participated in this. He survived the crucifixion and got married and participated in this. So interesting conspiracy theory, interesting alternative history that nobody really picked up on quite as powerfully as they do later. Then a few years later, in 1980, there was a historical discovery of some ossuaries. An ossuary is so in the old days, in the ancient world, it was very expensive to bury someone because they would have to carve out these caves from the rock, from the sides of the mountains. And so what you would do is you would actually rent one of these tombs. You would put the dead body of your loved one in there. And then after all of their flesh had rotted away and all that was left was their bones, you would remove the bones and you would put them in a little box. And the box was called an ossuary. And then they could reuse the tomb for another person and allow that person to decompose until they were ready to put them into an ossuary. So these ossuaries were discovered in Jerusalem in 1980, and they contained some Aramaic inscriptions on the outside of them. There were 3 of them. One of them said, Judah, son of Jesus. Another one said, Jesus, son of Joseph. And the third one said, Mariamne. And so some people decided that this little family that was found together in their ossuaries shows evidence of the family of Jesus, that Jesus, son of Joseph, and Mariamne, or Mary Magdalene, had a son named Judah, son of Jesus, and all 3 of them died either at the same time or at different times, and then they were buried together in their ossuaries. So this is a 1980 conspiracy theory that starts to circulate, but again, not, doesn't really take off in a super big way. 2 years later, we have another book that is published, and it's called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And this book was written as nonfiction. It was published as nonfiction. This is not a novel. This is not a story. This is published as fiction, as nonfiction. And what this book claims is that the Holy Grail, which is a mythological item, which in French is called the Saint Grail, Holy Grail, is actually the sang real, the royal blood. That's what it was referring to. And that Mary did birth a child in France who was the child of Jesus, royal blood. And this person became the ancestor of the Merovingian rulers of the early Frankish kingdom. And so this child that was born from Mary after Jesus died in the crucifixion is related by blood to these rulers in France. Now, eventually, 2 of the authors have admitted publicly that their quote unquote scholarship was not exactly rigorous, and that the stuff they wrote was not historically accurate. But just about 20 years after they published their book in 2003, this history that they wrote became the basis for probably what is the most famous of these works about the possibility that Jesus was married and had a child, called The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And his story plot and the quote unquote history of Jesus and Mary that is revealed through this thriller mystery is so close to that 1982 book that the publisher or the authors of the book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, actually sued Dan Brown for copyright infringement. But they lost their lawsuit because they had published their book as nonfiction. And so the judge said that Dan Brown had the right to use their book for research for his novel, just like he could have used any other historical information from any other historical nonfiction book, and it would not have been considered plagiarism, as long as he wasn't, copying word for word out of books that were not not properly attributed in his novel. So he, so any more than he needed to cite, or he needed to pay the writer of a historical, a textbook that talked about, the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, or, some other accepted historical fact. He didn't have to do that. And so he also didn't have to pay off these people for taking their idea, because even though they made it up, they published it as if it was nonfiction. And so he could use it as history, even though it is alternative history that, never really happened. So then after Dan Brown's book was published and it became really popular, and, it sold 80 million copies, the media saw a really good opportunity to make a lot of money. Why are people so interested in this question? Why is this important to people? And how can we, capitalize on this and make some money off of it? And so that's where you start to get all of these other novels that kind of talk about the same idea, where you start to get all of these supposed History Channel shows that talk about the Da Vinci Code uncoded, or the cracking the Da Vinci Code, or all these different things that, there were just endless. If you remember, in the early and mid 2000s, every other episode that came on the History Channel had something to do with this topic, because they knew that it would draw crowds, it would draw people to watch, and so they could make a lot of money off of the ads they ran during those episodes. So it became very very popular, very in vogue to think about and work on and talk about this particular topic. But why? Why are people so interested in this? That's what I want to talk to you about next. Any questions about this little bit of history? It would take me days to talk to you about everything that's always been involved with this, but just to kind of give you a few senses of how this has been going on for a long time. We're good? All right.
We're good.
So why does it matter? I think that there are a lot of different reasons why people care about this question, why people are interested in this question. And I think that one of the most basic reasons is because people want to know, did Jesus have sex? They want to know about this. And I think that there are people who are inside of Christianity and believe in Jesus as something bigger than just a man. And there are people outside of Christianity who want to prove the Christians wrong, that both are asking the same question because of this aspect of it. Did Jesus have sex? And we have to, I think that it comes down to the question, can a person be both sexual and holy? If Jesus had sex, would he be disqualified from being our savior? So, the idea of Jesus having sex is potentially a threat to our salvation. If you cannot participate in bodily passions, if you can't have sex, if you can't eat, rich foods, if you can't drink lots of wine and get drunk, all of these things that we consider to be sinful, or to be, kind of lower activities than what we should really be focusing on with prayer and, diminishment of ourselves and our bodily needs and things like that, then Jesus having sex is a diminishment of him as our savior. And so does that diminish our salvation in some way? Asking that question. But then we have to think about where our views of sex come from. And we did talk about this way back at the beginning when we first started Mixed Bag Musings, that we kind of inherited our disordered views of sex from especially the theologian Augustine, who felt that conception through sexual intercourse is the means of transferring original sin from generation to generation. And so he believed that not only did Jesus have to be conceived outside of sexual intercourse, but that Jesus could not participate in sexual intercourse because it is inherently a sin. But and that's pretty popular today, the idea that sex as a whole is something dirty, something bad, something that we should be ashamed of. But the Bible doesn't really say that. The Bible tells us that sex is a gift from God, but then that gift, like many others that we receive from God, is abused in a lot of different ways. And so is it the idea, the concept of sex itself that's bad, or is it the ways that we abuse each other using sex as a tool within that abuse that makes sex seem bad? And so we have to really think about that in terms of this question for in terms of Jesus engaging in sexual intercourse. Is that automatically wrong? Is that automatically dirty? Regardless of, is he having sex with his wife? Is he married to her? Or is he, sleeping around with random people? I think that matters in terms of, ethics. But do we assume that Jesus engaging in sexual relations is somehow diminishing him? And that's why we're interested in this question of, was Jesus married? Because then we assume that he would have engaged in sexual relationship with his wife. So is that part of what's going on here? Secondly, I think we're interested in Jesus' family. Did Jesus have children? I think this is a question of theology, but it's also a practical question. I think we as humans, we have impulses, we have desires for various types of intimacy and relationships with people, but we really struggle with how we balance our spirituality, our call from God, our relationship with God, with those desires to have families, to have relationships, to establish various types of intimacy in our lives. And this has been a struggle that's been going on, again, through the entirety of Christian history. Are monks or priests more holy than the rest of us because they don't get married? They don't focus, they are able to focus all of their attention on God because they don't have to worry about raising children or caring about their relationships with their spouse or, taking care of their spouse's physical and emotional needs. Does that make them better than the rest of us, closer to God than the rest of us? And that has certainly been the understanding in the past. But Martin Luther kind of tried to fix that a little bit. But then, is the idea that that being married or being unmarried, having children or not having children, do we sometimes kind of glorify or sanctify what we have chosen to do so that we claim that our particular choice is the quote unquote ideal mode of Christian life? So that, if I've decided that I'm going to get married, well, then I want Jesus to be married too, because then that kind of legitimizes my choice. Whereas if I say, oh no, I'm not getting married, I'm going to remain celibate through my life, then I kind of say, because Jesus did the same thing, and that, that makes what I'm doing more holy than what you're doing. Those kinds of petty things, or ways of trying to validate ourselves and our own choices might be involved in that a little bit. But then there's also a theological issue with this idea of Jesus potentially having children. When we're talking about those Christological controversies, the identity of Jesus. Well, if Jesus is fully God and fully human, does that mean that Jesus' children would inherit some of that divinity? Would a child of Jesus be, Jesus is sort of half God, half man, but not really. We're not supposed to say that. We're supposed to say fully God, fully man. But then if Jesus, procreates with a human woman, then is their child half God, or is their child a quarter God? Or, how does any of that work? Are Jesus' grandchildren 1/8 God? If we could trace all the people in history who are related to this person, do all of us have a tiny percentage of God in us that we were inherited from Jesus? It's all very confusing. And that just kind of piles on to all of the other confusing stuff that they actually had to address at the time that they were trying to figure out, who this Jesus person is and what makes him special, what makes him the person, the Savior, the Lord that he is, versus the rest of us. How do we differentiate him from us? Well, some of the way that we do that is by kind of putting up some boundaries for him that the rest of us don't have. And maybe one of those boundaries is being married, having sex, having children. And the idea that, the divinity and the humanity of Christ can exist together in this mysterious union that cannot be divided just adds so much more complication on top of all of these practical questions about, how do you have a marriage with someone who, yes, is fully human, but also has this mysterious divine part. You can't have a partnership with somebody who's also God. How do you have children? How do you understand what parts of this mysterious union are involved in any particular engagement with a woman or with a family or all of these things? And it just, asking these kinds of detailed questions makes believing the mystery and holding that mystery in tension so much harder, because then we have to start asking practical questions that cannot be answered when we are holding on to these mysteries. So I think we've got a lot at stake here in terms of, our Christology, who Jesus is, our salvation, our own understanding of who Jesus is, our relationship to things like sex and marriage and relationships, and how we connect to one another and how we should not connect to one another, and our ethics and what is and is not acceptable and the way that we engage with one another. All of these things are wrapped up in our interest in this question: was Jesus married? And so I think that's why people are interested in it. I don't think that they really care so much about whether Jesus was married. I think that they care about the implications of that potential question. So any comments on any of that, of what I said, or other ideas about why you think this question matters to people?
I often wonder when Jesus is ascended into heaven, if he was married, why didn't he take his wife with him?
Yeah. We did talk about, at one point, we talked a little bit about the post-resurrection period and some of the weird stuff that happened. And, Jesus definitely was not the same category of physical anymore. He could walk through walls, he could appear places, he could be unrecognizable to his closest friends. And so, maybe it has something to do with that he's no longer, he's no longer of that kind of realm. But that, again, that divides the realms, right? We're making those assumptions like the Greeks did, that there's a spiritual place where spiritual things belong and there's a physical place where physical things belong. Is that the correct way to understand all of this? And Greek philosophy really impacts the way that even our Bible is written and the assumptions that are made. And so some of those stories that were written and expressed maybe were colored by those assumptions. So it's really hard to untangle all of this.
So basically then, priests came down on not being married because of some decision that was made, I don't know, in the 1600s or what?
No, priests were not allowed to marry before that. The 1600s one was the Reformation change. That was that the priests have to do the marriages for other people.
But there is kind of a split between Protestants and Catholics on whether or not ministers are married or not.
Yes. So at that time, the Lutherans and the Reformed people who split off from the Catholic Church said that their leaders could be married, and so they didn't adhere to that anymore. But before that, they did.
So
And
where did they come down on the sin of sex?
well, so that's they said Jesus was not married. We know that because sex is sinful and dirty, and the Bible doesn't tell us anything about it. And we are supposed to be representing Christ to our congregants, to our parishes, and so it is our job to be as Christ-like as possible. And so we have to, we have to ignore all of these worldly things. We have to be spiritual. We have to be on the heavenly kingdom side of things as much as possible. Obviously, we have to eat.
That's the Pope's side. So how did the Protestants decide it was otherwise?
Yes. So the Protestants said, no, we are not here to be Jesus to our congregations. We are here to shepherd them, as humans. We are here to teach them because we've gone to school and we've learned. We are here to, be able to spend the time that is necessary to lead them, and help them to kind of make their decisions. But we are not, we're not in charge here. We are not the representatives of God, like the Catholic Church understands. The Pope is not married because the Pope is supposed to be the stand-in for Jesus, right? In a way that Protestants do not understand their leaders to be.
Okay.
All right. So wrapping it up for today, was Jesus married?
Good question.
Well, I think that asking this question is helpful for us because when we ask these questions related to whether Jesus was married or not, it helps us to be challenged in some of the assumptions that we make. When we ask a question like that, how would it affect our theology if Jesus was married? How would it affect my personal views, my ethical choices, the way that I engage with the world, the way that I engage with people that I meet, and in terms of the questions that they're asking or the behaviors that they're choosing to engage in. When we make assumptions about who Jesus is, who we are, what right and wrong is, we just can kind of go through our days in a way that allows those assumptions to just dictate who we are and what we're going to do. But if we ask these kinds of questions, then we can talk about them. We can talk about all these things. We can talk about these assumptions. We can even realize we have those assumptions because we're willing to ask the question. So I think it's a valuable question to ask, regardless of what you think. And there's no evidence either way, and so I can't really answer the question for you. But I think it's a helpful question to ask because it brings up all of these sub questions that help us to understand what our assumptions are. But I think, if you want to believe that Jesus was married, or you feel like there is some kind of evidence out there that I didn't bring up, or if somehow definitive evidence were to come up, I think that, it's a possible source of comfort for us. Jesus understands all of what I go through. Jesus, had a partner. Jesus had to wrestle with the realities of how you live day to day with another person, and you balance each other's needs, and you support each other, and you argue with each other, and you do all the things that happen in a spousal relationship. And maybe Jesus had children, and so Jesus understands how frustrated I get when my kids won't clean their rooms, and all these types of things. And so it can help us to think about those types of things, whether or not it's true. I think it's comforting to us, and I think it is true that Jesus does understand what it means to be human and all of the different things that we go through. Just because Jesus didn't have a cell phone in his pocket, that doesn't mean that he didn't understand how hard it is to struggle with, giving attention to the people outside of us and wanting to fill our own needs and our own desires for kind of personal space and personal uplifting, and the temptations of addictions and all the different things that we've got going on today can be kind of universalized into what humans experience. So I think we can say that Jesus understands everything of what we go through. Either way, but I think it can be comforting to think that Jesus actually did these things. So I don't think there's anything really wrong with it. But I think at the end of the day, it's important for us to remember that even if somehow we found some kind of definitive evidence that Jesus was married, that it wouldn't really matter, because Jesus being married doesn't make him any less who he is to us and who he is for us.
Right.
Jesus is still the savior of the world. Jesus is still our Lord. Jesus is still our way to access God and have that relationship. Jesus is still the one who mentors us, comforts us, shows us the way to live our lives. And so I think it's just important that if you're thinking about this question, don't allow it to kind of unravel your whole faith. I think that if your faith can be unraveled by it, then I think it's because your faith needs some examination. And I think just being here and participating in these questions shows that you have a deep and investigated kind of faith that allows you to ask these questions without being threatened by them. And so if you are out there listening to this and you're feeling threatened by this question, I would invite you to think about why you feel that way, and maybe you need to do a little bit more digging in terms of the foundations of your faith and come up with some potentially new understandings. So to wrap us up today, I want to bring us a verse that we hear during Advent or on Christmas Eve sometimes. Just a reminder, John chapter 1, verse 18. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. And so whoever Jesus is, a married person, an unmarried person, a brown guy with a beard and really smelly feet and armpits, whoever he is in other ways, we have to remember that his primary identity is he is our avenue to God. He is the one who makes God known to us. He is the one who brings God close to us. And so hope you can carry that with you away from this class. So final thoughts, questions, disagreements?
Nope, that was great.
No, thank you.
All right.
Yep.
So
I think he still stands no matter which way it goes.
yes,
That's right.
I think so. So next week we will ask the question, what is Christian anarchy? That'll be a fun one.
One of these weeks I'm not going to be here. I think next week is okay. Yeah, I'll be here next week. Okay.
All right. Well,
Okay.
everybody take care, and I will see you next week.
Okay.
Thanks,
Same
Katie.
bad time, same bad channel.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.